Good morning, Penn State fans. Blue-White Breakdown here with Max Ralph and Johnny McGonigal on PennLive. It is Wednesday, December 11th, and we thought maybe we'd do a little bit of a transfer portal podcast here this morning. Portal opened on Monday, the 9th. It stays open until the 28th, and then doesn't open again until April 16th. So you're going to see probably most of the action during this December period. I think I saw a number that yesterday already like 1,700 players had jumped into the portal. It is wild, unpredictable. It's going to just keep marching forward until we have some rule changes, which I'm not really sure when those would come about. But yeah, the portal is crazy. There's tons of people in it. Penn State, James Franklin said he's going to have his staff be very aggressive in the portal, despite having to prepare for a playoff game right now, too. There's a lot going on in Penn State world. But, Johnny, I think the transfer portal is prevalent and important to talk about and kind of preview next year's team. And how you doing this morning?
I'm doing well. Yeah, you mentioned it, right? The portal's already open. I think we would have had a podcast on Sunday or Monday previewing the opening of the portal, if not for Penn State playing in the Big Ten Championship. Like, that was unexpected.
Yep.
Them being in Indy on Saturday night and then a long way back home for both of us, from Lucas Oil Stadium and from that Big Ten title game. So we're recording this now Wednesday morning, and currently Penn State has two players who have at least announced intentions or plans to go in the portal. A lot of guys announce that they're going in the portal, but they're actually not in yet, and it takes a little bit. The portal opened like we said, on Monday, and the winter window closes on the 28th. Correct, Max?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And then it opens again in the spring. But so far, Penn State has two players in. Jerry Cross, tight end, not a surprise. Wasn't making an impact in that room. That obviously this year has Tyler Warren, sucking up all the targets.
Yep.
But then you've also got Khalil Dinkins, who's a veteran. Luke Reynolds, an up-and-coming five-star. They brought in Andrew Olesh in the 2025 class, as well as a couple others. So not a surprise to see Jerry Cross head out the door. And then T.A. Cunningham, a defensive tackle from the 2024 recruiting class who didn't play his first and only year at Penn State, had transferred high schools, and seemed like a guy who might end up just testing the waters and heading elsewhere. So not a surprise there either, Max. We're going to talk about, positions that Penn State could be targeting, positions that Penn State could be losing from, moving forward now over the next couple of weeks with the winter window still open. So where do you want to start? You want to start with additions or potential subtractions?
Yeah, I mean, I think we could almost do it hand in hand.
That's fair.
Let's at least start with the elephant in the room of wide receiver and Penn State's plans there. I will say, and also you mentioned the tight end room. Don't forget about Andrew Rappelier, who is out with that injury this year.
He was hurt, so it was not on my mind. But he was supposed to have a huge role this year. Former 4-star blue chip guy, like they love him. So do not forget. Like I forgot very briefly about Andrew Rappelier.
Yeah, crowded tight end room for sure. So not hard to see why Jerry Cross could have maybe seen the writing on the wall there. Defensive line for Cunningham, I think you're right. Is a guy who, might have seemed like he was going to test the waters, but it's a position where we think he could probably have seen some playing time before too long, just with the way things are going to go. But wide receiver, let's start there because it's the big one. It's the big one everybody wants to hear about. It's the big one that Penn State needs to add at because, again, you look down Penn State's 2 losses this year against elite competition, and the wide receivers were pretty non-existent. Trey Wallace made some really big plays down the stretch against Oregon this past weekend. A touchdown in the 3rd and 15 conversion in the first half, and I'm trying to think. There were a couple other ones. He ended up stat-wise like with a decent day with a touchdown, but he and the rest of the wide receivers, and that being just Omari Evans, had 2 catches through 3 quarters of play in the Big Ten championship game. That's a problem. It's a flat out problem. Penn State needs more at wide receiver. We know this. It's not a secret to anybody who's watching this podcast, but I think when you project that room next year, it's kind of tough to do because they've got, I think, everybody except Julian Fleming is eligible to come back. The question is, how many guys do they want back? How different do they want this room to look? How many snaps do they think they're going to be allocating to freshmen next year? Like incoming freshmen and this year's freshmen is what I'm getting at. I think it's a tough room to project, but I do think bottom line is they're going to try and bring in 2 to 3 guys out of the portal. And there are some interesting names out there. I mean, I've been, as addicted to Twitter as I am, like I see every single guy that goes into the portal with whatever it is, Hayes Fawcett, 24/7 Rivals, whoever's reporting it. And there are some serious wide receiver names out there. I wrote in a story this week on PennLive where I kind of highlighted a few names, but like there's loaded talent at the position. I'm not sure how high Penn State can swing at wide receiver, but there are names to go get. I mean, look at a guy like Auburn star freshman Cam Coleman. I don't like they're not going to be in play for him, but
is he in the portal? Because I saw that there was some conflicting reports last time I checked.
Okay, that might have changed since I last looked, but I did see.
It's tough to keep up, man. It's tough to keep up.
Yeah, but my point is like there's talent out there. I'm not sure that Penn State could go get a guy like that if he was in there. I don't think they could. But there are like second tier guys that Penn State's gonna try and go after, and they need to. So this room's kind of hard to project for next year. But Johnny, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think my first thought was for 3 quarters in the Big Ten title game, it looked like the Peach Bowl, where Penn State's wide receivers were really a non-factor. I mean, you had the well-designed touchdown to Amari Evans, and you had that 3rd down conversion early by Trey Wallace. But aside from that, like you mentioned, Max, 2 catches through 3 quarters for Penn State's wide receivers against Oregon, a team that had, 11 receptions and 181 yards from Tez Johnson. So, like, the talent gap at wide receiver was on display in the Big Ten title game. And it's a concern that a year on from the Peach Bowl that they were pretty much in the same spot of targeting other players and other positions, namely Tyler Warren, and then the guys, leaning on the run game with Nick and Katron. Tyler Warren's not going to be there next year to take all those targets. Nick Singleton might be in the NFL. Katron Allen might be as well. And so they need to allocate NIL funds, what they have, to go out and get not just like a maybe project wide receiver. Like, I think they need to swing big and try to get one of these top receivers out of the portal. Like Kevin Concepcion from NC State, like he's garnering, interest seemingly from the SEC, Alabama, A&M, but Penn State could be in the mix there. Guys like that, guys who have proven it at the Power 5 level that they're able to make an impact and make a big impact. Because like you mentioned, this wide receiver room now going into next year, like it is kind of in flux, right? You've got 4 guys coming in the 2025 recruiting class that'll be on scholarship. You've got 3 wide receivers from the 24 recruiting class on scholarship. Tyseer Denmark making the early strides of that group in the 2024 class. Then you've got like Anthony Ivey and Tyler Johnson and a handful of guys who really, I mean, Caden Saunders, who have not made the type of impact that you would have expected, guys from the 2023 and 2022 recruiting classes, that I wouldn't be surprised if they moved on. And seeing the writing on the wall that, look, it's not going to happen for me here. Go elsewhere, find some playing time, and free up some scholarships for Penn State to go after receivers who could help. Drew Aller, if he comes back, he's getting some NFL buzz more than he was, during the regular season after the performance that he had, in the Big Ten title game. But if he comes back, he's going to need a guy or two to throw to. And I also think on that, like I look at a Mitchell Tinsley, a guy they got before the 2022 season who came in from Western Kentucky, had 1 year, played really well. Like you can afford to go out and get one of those guys, but I think it would kind of behoove Penn State to maybe look at a sophomore or, a
Yep.
redshirt sophomore or, a freshman who, and there are guys like that out there. I think this year in the portal more than last, at least so far, there are more wide receivers that have like made impacts where they were at, but also who are younger, who
Yep.
could grow within a program, over the course of 2 years. And it's not just like a 1 year rental. So something to keep in mind there as well. But the wide receiver position is priority number one for James Franklin and his staff, bar none. Not only now in the winter portal, but also I think you're going to see in the spring portal, some guys who are on college football playoff teams
Hmm.
who were making impacts but want to maybe take a step up or just get a new, fresh scenery kind of deal. I wouldn't be surprised if you see some impact players from CFP teams as well into the portal during the spring window.
Yeah, I think you brought up a couple things that I wanted to hit on. Drew Aller's decision, I think, is also going to play a part in this. I don't think there's a world where no matter what he does, they bring in a quarterback necessarily. Because if he's gone, Bo stays probably and probably is the starter. We've heard great things about Ethan Grunkemeyer and some chatter about Jackson Smolik too, who obviously has missed the entire year with some injury. Um, but if Drew stays, that completely changes Penn State's recruiting pitch for a wide receiver too, and say, listen, you're playing with a guy who could get drafted in the first round, who has elite arm talent, who is really taking control of this offense. And if you're a receiver who wants to go to the NFL, that's the way to do it, is to play with a guy who can sling it. So I think the book is still out on what Aller's going to do. I think it depends on the feedback he gets from NFL personnel here down the stretch. I do also think that kind of the ideal world for Penn State in this transfer portal class is, like I said, I think it's got to be 2 to 3 guys. It's not going to be just one like it was with Fleming last year. That was a miss. Not the Fleming addition was like good for them to go out and get him, whatever, barring his production on the field. But what I mean is it was a miss to only add him at the position. And I think Penn State knows that. They tried for other guys, didn't win them. I think the push this year is going to be a little bit different, a little more significant. And I think it's got to be 2 to 3 guys. I think in an ideal world, you see a guy like Concepcion who's coming from a power conference team, or a guy who has like a high level recruiting background with not a lot of experience at a power 4 team, added with a guy who was productive at the lower levels. A guy like, I've seen a lot of buzz for FIU's Eric Rivers. I've also heard the name Miami, Ohio's Reggie Virgil, who is a guy who averaged almost 20 yards a catch. I think that's going to be the pairing, is get like a guy who has some upside from the power 4 level, maybe 2 guys. Like maybe you get a guy like Concepcion who's done it, and a guy who's like a former high 4, low 5-star prospect who's looking for a bounce back. And then you get one of those lower level guys. It's going to take a lot. Like it's going to take investment from the staff. But if you want to turn this thing around, like I think that's where you got to go. I think that's what it is.
Yeah. And a couple more things to add, just putting myself in the shoes of a wide receiver in the portal, and you get contacted by Penn State. One, if Drew comes back, like you mentioned, the elite arm talent that he has, the development that he's shown this year, to be, talked about by NFL people right now, and just the tape, right? Like what we've seen from him over the last, few months I think has been really impressive.
I
So
agree.
you can come in and potentially play with a quarterback of that caliber. If you're Penn State, you're selling, hey, Tyler Warren's gone. And you know who else is gone? Or you know what else is gone? His 88 catches. All the targets that he's had
Yep.
was walking right out the door. And you can come in, walk right in the door, and have a big piece of that, have a big piece of that pie. The other bit of it
Mm-hmm.
is Andy Kotelnicki, announcing that he's
Yep.
coming back to Penn State. The Penn State's offensive coordinator, who was in the mix for the West Virginia job, I'm sure was floated at other head coaching gigs as well. He tweeted out the other day that, look, I'm coming back, looking forward to Penn State in 2025. So you have a creative, innovative offensive coordinator that was wanted, or at least was in the mix for head coaching jobs after 1 year in Happy Valley, which tells you a lot about how he is respected within the coaching community, how he's respected amongst his players and the rest of the staff in State College. And you have that system and that coordinator and that play caller to sell to wide receivers. I think it was tougher for Penn State, last year and the year before to get, wide receivers out of the portal when Yursich was the coordinator. And then when Yursich was fired, it's like, okay, they're bringing in this new coordinator, but we haven't seen it on the field. We don't know what the deal is there. So I think Penn State is just in a better position right now than they were last year, both from an NIL standpoint, from a system standpoint, from a proof of concept standpoint, to sell to these wide receivers to come to Happy Valley and have a productive rest of your career and look towards the NFL.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think we could probably spend another 15 minutes talking about the wide receiver position and the way that Penn State has to add at it, some guys who could leave. I will say, I always struggle to kind of predict who I think is leaving from a position, because it's tough to say oh, this kid who's been here 3 or 4 years loves Penn State, wanted to come here his whole life, needs to transfer because he sucks.
Yeah. I know. It's tough. It's tough.
Yeah.
It's also a business.
It's the reality, and I think that you're going to see probably 3 to 5 names out of that wide receiver group this year, who, whether it be graduation, whether it be transfer portal, whatever it is, it's going to happen. And it unfortunately needs to. Let's move on to the other side of the ball with the second and third position that we think are far and away the most obvious. I really think that these 3 positions that we're going to hit on are the ones that are clear portal needs. There will be other positions that Penn State wants to add at that we can touch on at the end. But let's start with the defensive line, and then after this go to linebacker, because I think that when you put together a preview of this roster for next year, which hinges on a lot of things still, I think wide receiver, defensive line, and linebacker are the ones that are clear. So let's start on the defensive line, Johnny. I would be flabbergasted if Abdul Carter came back in 2025. He's going to be a top 10 pick, but there is that possibility, he does have eligibility. We're just going to put it there, but I'd be flabbergasted.
He ain't coming back. Drew Rosenhaus hanging out with his family at games.
I know.
He ain't coming back.
I know. I'm just saying there is a possibility. I'm just putting it out there. I think the more interesting one is Deni Dennis Sutton, who is probably a draft candidate in probably the mid rounds because of his physical tools, but hasn't really had the production like Abdul. And if he came back in one more year and was the guy, could probably shoot up into the second round, and maybe an outside shot at the first round would be a really big boost for Penn State. But he has a decision to make that would change where this thing goes, because if you look behind those 2 guys, edge rusher is pretty thin. What's the deal with an injured Zariah Fisher? Probably not coming back, but I think he could probably get a medical waiver to come back if he wanted to. Amin Vanover is I believe done. I just looked at this the other day.
Yeah,
he might have a COVID year, but
I think he's done.
Okay, so I think Amin Vanover's done. Smith Vilbert, I believe, is also done. There are a few freshmen. Max Granville and Jalen Harvey have gotten some buzz this year, a little bit of run on the field, but yeah, it's just defensive end is a little bit of a thin group with some question marks next year. And even if you look way out at projecting some of the 2025 signees, there's not any of them at defensive end that really scream day one players, So I think that's part of why they wanted to get Max Granville on campus early, because they saw this coming. But they're going to have to add at defensive end, even if on the odd chance Abdul stays, or even if they see Granville or Harvey being a starter next year from day one, they need depth, badly at that position. And the same goes for a defensive tackle, which is maybe in a little bit less of a tight spot, but you are losing Devon J. Thomas, Keziah Izzard, I looked, he should have a COVID year. Whether he takes it or not, that's something that I'm, not privy to at this point in time. Alonzo Ford was playing really well this year in a rotational role. Believe he could come back, but he's had two major injuries. Question what he's got left in him when he comes back. There's some young guys who we don't really know a lot about: Xavier Gilliam, Ty Blanding, Caleb Artis. But they're going to need. Oh, and Zane Durant. God, I'm forgetting the obvious one. Undersized, but really productive. Does he go to the NFL? It's questionable, So defensive line, at the very least, is going to need depth, and that's where you got to look next, beyond wide receiver, if you ask me.
Yeah, I mean they'll need depth at the very least. They might need starters
Yeah,
because, like, I know you said there's a chance. Like, Abdul Carter ain't coming back. Like,
I
he's
know.
he's going to go to the NFL and be a top 5 to 10 pick. Denai Dennis Sutton has a decision on his hands because of the injury and otherwise, like, that he was dealing with throughout the year. He has not put up the numbers that he would have hoped,
Yeah,
and that frankly we would have expected coming into the year, because he was a guy as well that was talked about as maybe a fringe first rounder. He
yeah,
has the tools, the size, like everything about him. He's got what you want, as an NFL team in an edge rusher, but he might come back. Zane Durant, if that guy goes to the NFL, he's going to test like crazy at the combine,
yes,
for a defensive tackle. His explosiveness on the interior is among the best in college football. Does he get a good enough draft grade to leave? I wouldn't be surprised if he does, because he has had, I think from a national standpoint, from like a media standpoint, like, he got disrespected on the all Big Ten teams and
oh
everything.
god, yeah,
But I think NFL scouts recognize how good of a year he's had and how good of a
yeah,
player he is. So you could potentially be losing 3 of your 4 starters. Well, and Devontae Thomas is out of eligibility. So there's a possibility that you lose all 4 starters on the defensive front. And you're looking at the guys behind him. We
hmm
talked about defensive end and what they have and what they don't have there. Jamel Lyons being dismissed from the team, like, they were counting on him, to be like that next guy up at defensive end, and he's no longer with the program for reasons we've reported. And so, at defensive end, they could be shopping in the portal. Defensive tackle, they could be shopping in the portal. Another factor there is like Hakeem Beamon leaving midseason as well. So, like, in terms of just depth and pieces on the defensive line, wouldn't be surprised if they go in the portal and pick up a couple of edge rushers and a D tackle. You wrote about Bear Alexander, right,
I
Max?
did, yeah.
As a possibility.
hmm Yeah, he. So, I mean, take it for what you will, but Hayes Fawcett, the On3 guy, said Penn State is one of 3 teams standing out to Bear Alexander. I don't believe there's a public offer out there yet. He's another guy who, like you mentioned with T.A. Cunningham, transferred high schools a couple times, and has now transferred. This will be his 3rd team in college. There's some question marks, but it is hard to deny the fact that he is a good sized defensive tackle, 6'3", 215, who had some serious prospect pedigree and production through the first 2 years of his career. I mean, when he was at Georgia as a freshman, played in 12 games. It's tough to do on Georgia's defense. And then he went over to USC and had a really good year as a sophomore before deciding to redshirt this past season after 3 games. There's some question marks about, whatever you want to attribute it to, but the kid has talent and could be a really interesting one to shore up the front for Penn State.
And another one as well, when we're talking about guys who are Penn State's interested in.
Mm-hmm.
I saw on Tuesday that they sent out an offer to David Blay, who
Yep.
is a defensive tackle from Louisiana Tech. He was first team all conference, and is from the Philly area, from
Yep.
just northeast of the city. So that's one where Deion Barnes, who is a Philly native, who is Penn State's defensive line coach, could be something there, something to keep an eye on, on the interior defensive line. Max, we spent a good amount of time on wide receiver, on the D line up front. To close this thing out, let's talk linebackers, because
Yeah.
they've got Kobe King, they've got Tony Rojas, but the depth behind them, I like what Anthony Specca has shown,
Mm-hmm.
but the depth behind them could use some bolstering.
Yeah, there's, question marks. We haven't really seen anything out of Kari Jackson this year, who was another one of those fairly highly touted freshmen in the 24 class. Specca's good. He looks good. But Tony Rojas, I think I just saw the stat for as talented as he is and for as much buzz as he got going into this year. I believe he finished as the second lowest graded defender on Penn State's roster per PFF, which, again, take that with a grain of salt. PFF is imperfect, but sometimes it can serve as a pretty good benchmark. And I think the only guy who was below him was Tyler Elsdon, who I don't know if he has another year of eligibility or not, but I think that's probably a guy who is not going to be part of next year's defense. I don't know. But I think with Kobe King, I don't know anything about his situation, but if I'm Kobe, I'm looking at what happened at Kalen, where guy was pretty productive but struggled at the end of the year. Kobe was kind of the opposite. He's been really freaking good this year, and especially of late. But I just think he's a guy who's not really getting buzzed about nationally. I'm coming back, and I'm going to go make myself a third, fourth round pick at middle linebacker. But that's hard to say if that's the decision he's going to make. And Tony is going to be back, but he's got a lot of growing to do. Anthony Specca is an interesting one, but they could certainly use some help. And even if you stretch out to look at that third linebacker spot, which they use a little less frequently than some teams because of how much nickel they play, Dom DeLuca is a solid player, but he has flaws. And Dakari Nelson is still learning the position. So it's definitely a spot they need to add, if nothing for depth pieces. It could be a situation where they look at a one-year rental guy from a smaller school. There was a really interesting name I saw, Joseph Sipp from Bowling Green. The guy has no ties to Pennsylvania or Penn State as far as I'm aware, but they saw him play on the field. He had 75 tackles. He's a one-year rental. Like, a guy like that is just a name that it seems like what they should be going for at linebacker is kind of a stopgap that can play 45% of your snaps, maybe more. There's also a guy like Josiah Trotter, who is not that type of guy. He's got 3 years of eligibility and is a extremely talented player from St. Joe's Prep in Philly, who Penn State wanted out of high school. And so the other thing to keep in mind is that when you're looking at the portal, guys from Pennsylvania and guys who Penn State recruited in high school are always going to be at the top of the list. So I think Josiah Trotter is a name that will be talked about for Penn State. Now, whether they can land him the second time around, he's going to get some big offers out there in the portal again. So it just depends on whether they can bring him in. But yeah, that linebacker spot is concerning right now.
Yeah, and one thing I'll just add on that, because I agree with you wholeheartedly, Max. One thing I'll just add on that is the impact that Dan Connor could have on all this. Yeah. As an analyst, we've heard, throughout the year, the impact, and really the last year as well, the impact that he's had on the room, the impact that he's had on the defense as a former linebacker U legend, and on the recruiting trail, talking to high school recruits. I remember going to Central Catholic last year and talking to Anthony Specca before he signed with Penn State. And he was talking about, that Dan Connor was a massive reason why he ultimately decided to go to Penn State. And he had interest from Michigan and a bunch of other schools. Don't rule out that Dan Connor could have an impact here when it comes to recruiting a linebacker out of the portal. No better guy to sell, the Penn State linebacker U vibes and vision than Dan Connor.
Yeah. I think it brings up an interesting thought too, is like, how long is a guy like that going to be able to stick around as an analyst at Penn State when he is seen as such a rising star? And, linebacker, the specific linebackers coach is obviously taken up by Tom Allen. So, it's not a situation like Danny O'Brien, who was a GA and then, graduated into the quarterbacks coach because Andy Kotelnicki's not doing it. But yeah, Dan Connor gotten a lot of love for a lot of good reasons. Let's wrap this up a little bit by just pointing out a few positions that might kind of surprise some people for significant ads. But I think running back is one where you kind of look and I compared it to the addition of Trey Potts 2 years ago. I think no matter what, if Nick Singleton and Katron Allen, for whatever reason, come back, both of them, which I really struggle to see a world where both come back. It's not out of the question, but I struggle to see that. But if they're both gone, I think that getting a guy like Trey Potts who can be a spark behind your regular rotation of younger running backs would make a lot of sense. Johnny, thoughts on running back or another position you want to highlight?
Yeah. One quick position, defensive back.
Mm-hmm.
KJ Winston, we don't know what he's going to do after the long-term injury, season-ending injury that he suffered. Projected first-round pick before the year. Could ultimately go to the NFL. Could decide to come back. Jalen Reed out of eligibility. He's been indispensable for this defense this year. And also at corner, I believe Jalen Kimber is out of eligibility. So, maybe they go and try to pick up a guy through the portal in the secondary like Terry Smith did last year in restocking. Maybe they're just confident with the guys that they have in those two respective rooms. But running back, I mean, Max, if I had to guess right now, I'm going to guess that both Nick and Katron are not back.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, like you mentioned, Cam Wallace is coming off the injury. You have Quentin Martin and Corey Smith from the 2024 class. You've got, Tyke Hayes and Jabri Wallace Coleman coming in the 2025 class. They might want to add a Trey Potts type to that room to, at the very least, breed some more competition, have a veteran presence in the room if Nick and Katron are not there. Just something to consider. But yeah, if I had to guess right now, I would say that Nick and Katron will not be back. And so you're going to be looking at a different, whether that's by committee or a true bell cow running back at Penn State in 2025.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I do think those two freshmen that are coming in are going to have a shot to play right away. That's kind of my hot take at the position, assuming Nick and Katron are both gone. I think those young guys are going to have a shot to get some snaps. I think it'll be similar to Quentin and Corey this year, where they're not burning their red shirt, but get a chance to flash a little bit, because those two are really good. They have great film coming out of high school. I think defensive back is a great one to highlight. If you didn't do it, I was going to. I definitely think they're going to try and add at safety, at least one guy, and probably a guy that's not a project, like a guy that can come in and contribute, because obviously Dejon Lane has some hype. He's a good player. Zachy Wheatley technically has a decision to make. I think I'd be a little surprised if he left based on his production and the buzz about him. But Dejon Lane, Zachy Wheatley, KJ Winston, whether he's back or not, I think they still need a fourth guy in that room that can play here and there. So I definitely think that's a spot. Corner's a little bit different this year than it was last year, because obviously they lost all three starters last year. You lose one this year, but even behind that one, there are guys who they really, really like. Last year it was a little more up in the air with, what is Elliott Washington? What is Zion Tracy? We don't really know right now. Now we know that those guys can come in and contribute right away. So corner, I think they'd take a guy if there was a fit that they loved. If there was a PA guy, really talented, who they could bring back home. But generally speaking, I don't think corner is one that they'll add at specifically, that they'll target hard. And the last one, and this one shouldn't really come as a surprise to anybody, offensive line. Not a position that they're going to seek out. Pretty much every guy on that starting line right now can and should come back, except for Sal Wormley, but they've got Cooper Cousins to slot into that guard spot. They've got a lot of guys younger that they like on the offensive line, but bodies at that position. It is never a bad thing to have more bodies. Look at all the injuries Penn State has had on the offensive line this year. They're going to bring in a transfer too at the position, if you ask me.
Does Nick Dawkins have eligibility? Because I think he
has one more year. But
I don't know, because he redshirted in 2020, which was the COVID year. So that's a wash, right?
No. So you can't, I don't think you can count a redshirt and the COVID year the same year. Like they would just take it as, they would just take it as one or the other. So.
I entered this, we're not in the offseason, obviously, because the playoff is going on. We've got that next weekend. But I mentally entered the portal season, so to speak, thinking that the COVID years were done with, and I don't.
Yeah, they're not.
I guess they're not. It's tough to keep track of. But
Yeah,
Yeah,
this is
I mean,
only Dawkins' fifth season, and since he enrolled in 2020, that means he's got another year.
yeah. So they'll be fine on the offensive line. Like
Mhm.
the biggest ones, like wide receiver is the absolute like paramount position of importance. They
Mhm.
need to hit on wide receiver in the portal, and it doesn't necessarily have to come in the December portal because, like I mentioned, there are going to be guys that enter in the spring. But I mean, you'd much rather have one or two guys from the portal at wide receiver in the winter, so that they can go through your winter workouts, so that they can go through spring ball, and start building rapport with Drew Aller or Bo or whoever is at quarterback. Um, that is huge. So wide receiver
Mhm.
number one. Defensive line is there as well, linebacker, and then you start to fill a spot or two if you can.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty clear what they got to go out and get. I think like the staff is keenly aware of that. Like there's no secrets. I don't think there's any secrets that they want to go out and get those guys either. But what wide receiver is like depending on how this offseason goes, and this might be a hot take, but this offseason is really important for Penn State's personnel at wide receiver. Um, I think Marcus Higgins has to hit this year. I think he and James Franklin both have to hit on at least one guy. And that's to say nothing of like Marcus Higgins is an awesome guy, really great to talk to. Recruits and wide receivers from the team love him, but you get to a certain point where if you don't have the production for a couple of years, you ask some questions. So it's a pressure filled year at wide receiver for Penn State, and the transfer portal's got to be a big part of it.
Yeah, and one thing to add too is a lot of it is those relationships, personalities meshing. Whether it's Marcus Higgins at wide receivers coach, your offensive coordinator James Franklin with these players, and more specifically, at wide receiver. It's also like there's just some things in the portal that happen that, like, whether it's academics, the stuff not transferring over. There was a guy or two in the portal last year that Penn State thought it would have, or thought they were really, close to getting, and it just didn't work out from a logistics standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's something to keep in mind as well as we navigate the portal. It's not all just, they don't want to come in because, these people, coaches aren't recruiting them, or, Penn State doesn't have the money for them.
Right.
Sometimes there are other logistics at play here, which is tough, to really get through the weeds and read the tea leaves and get to a point where we fully understand why a certain guy didn't come to Penn State or why it didn't work out or whatever. But it's a crazy season. The
Mm-hmm.
portal season is crazy, and we're going to do our best to keep everyone up to date and as informed as possible on Penn State's happenings.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that'll do it for us on the Blue White Breakdown, presented by PennLive, Max Ralph, and Johnny McGonigal. Stick with us. Portal season is just getting going, and so is the playoff, which we barely mentioned in this podcast. Stay tuned. We'll have a lot moving forward. Take care.